Dr. Rohit Ramaswamy is a professor of pediatrics at the James M. Anderson Center for Health Systems Excellence. Prior to joining Cincinnati Children's, he was the associate director of the Public Health Leadership Program and a professor in maternal and child health at the Gillings School of Global Public Health at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Obviously, the in-between transition here. Dr. Ramaswamy's area of expertise is in implementation and improvement science, which deals with the development and evaluation of systematic methods and tools to sustainably implement and improve complex interventions. And this is what he's here to tell us all about today. And he is our point person between UC and Children's. So kick it off, Rohit. Thanks for being here today.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you for the opportunity. As Stephanie said, I'm new to Children's and I'm new to the Anderson Center. But one of the kind of reasons that I joined and the CCTST has been working with me is to begin to develop implementation science capability across the institutions that form the CCTST. So this is, in a sense, kind of a introductory event, and there are other things that I will talk about at the end of this talk in terms of how we're going to continue to provide resources for the different organizations to continue research in this field. Today's talk is really just going to be an overview of implementation science. It is a emerging field, and so there's a lot of work going on in implementation science. But because it is an emerging field, it is also a field that is quite confusing to those who are entering into it for the first time, because there is a lot of jargon, there's a lot of terminology. And so, like with anything else, like any new field, being able to learn the language is a good starting point before people dive deeper into the research. And so this is really about my goal today is just to define implementation science and describe why it is important, explain some principles and concepts and some tools and frameworks and language, and then discuss some implementation research design. So it's intended to be kind of hopefully a soft introduction, an easy introduction to the field, provide an overview. I welcome also, because talking in Zoom is always a challenge because you don't really see anybody else. So what I will do is I will stop at various points in time and take questions. The questions could be either on chat or spoken out. Stephanie has graciously consented to monitor the chat so that I don't need to do that. And I will also try and end about 10 minutes or so before 1 o'clock, so we have a chance to have a discussion and other conversation as well. So when we begin to think about why implementation science, what is it? What is the scope of problems that this field addresses? What it really does is it looks at we spend a lot of our time as clinical researchers, as translational researchers, as public health researchers. We spend a lot of our time in creating knowledge. Knowledge creation is always generating evidence for what works is a lot of what our focus is. And so we spend a lot of our time developing good research designs, focusing on internal validity, making sure that we are eliminating bias. And so there is this large body of evidence about clinical, public health, educational interventions that we know works. But we know that these work in these lab settings, in these settings that we have carefully engineered and tested. But then when we land up in the real world, it's a whole different story, because the kinds of things that are needed to take what we know works and make it work in the real world has little to do with our expertise as researchers. It has little to do with how carefully we have set up our research designs. And instead, it has to do with a lot of kind of factors that may or may not be within our control. So we need to have engaged communities. We need to have the appropriate infrastructure. We need to have staff. We need to have policies. We need to have processes. And I do a lot of work in global health settings where, of course, there's always these resource constraints. And so the question becomes, even though we have this kind of body of knowledge, this body of evidence that we know works, how do we actually make it work in practice? How do we make it work in practical settings? Because that ultimately, if you really did want to think about improving population, improving the outcomes for populations at scale, we're going to need to know how to make things work. And we're going to need to know how to make things work, not just on a case-by-case basis where we're kind of stumbling along and using trial and error and trying to figure out how to make things work. But instead, we're beginning to have as much of a body of knowledge, a body of evidence about how to make things work as we do about the body of knowledge about what works. And so this is really kind of what the focus of implementation science as a field is. And so a few years ago, some clever people at UNC came up with this kind of what they call the formula for success. And the idea was that, therefore, if you really wanted to get significant outcomes in whether it's in social services or whether it's in education or whether it's in public health or whether it's in medicine, we need to obviously have effective innovations. We need to make sure that we're having the right interventions. But the interventions themselves are just kind of one part of this multiplicative formula. You need to have the interventions, but you also need to have effective implementation. And then you need to have the context that enables implementation to take place. And the multiplication, of course, is that without any of these, if any of these is small or any of these is zero, then ultimately you're not going to get your outcomes. And so we spend a lot of our time, as I said earlier, talking about research designs for effective innovations. What I am actually going to talk about is this kind of middle box here, about what do we know about effective implementation? What do we know about how to research effective implementation? And what do we not know? There's a lot that we don't know as well. And hopefully that then begins to stimulate you to think about how do we, as we're beginning to think about doing our research work around better effective implementation of what we know, what are some of the kinds of things we need to take into consideration? I'm going to start with an example that gets trotted around as a classic example for where kind of implementation science is needed. And this is the surgical safety checklist. And many of you are probably already aware of the history behind this checklist. So Atul Gawande, who is now quite famous, as much as an author as he is a clinician, introduced this notion of this checklist as having looked at the use of checklists in a variety of different industries, especially the airline industry, where the pilots use this checklist before they take off, began to promote this checklist as a way for improving surgical outcomes, for reducing surgical morbidity and mortality, by allowing teams to work together to be able to make sure that all the different things that need to happen during a surgical process are actually happening. This was because Atul Gawande is a compelling writer, because he is very popular. This became a popular book. If you read the Amazon reviews to this book, it says it's a simple solution to solve complex problems. And of course, that's kind of a little bit of marketing lingo. But the reality was that the WHO took it on. There were a lot of articles. There was a variety of global studies that were done that demonstrated that using the manifesto, using the checklist resulted in significant reductions in morbidity and mortality. And so the WHO began to promote this globally as something that is global best practice. About 5 or 6 years ago, there was a study that was conducted in Ontario across 101 hospitals that had used the surgical safety checklist to get a sense of, okay, so what is it actually from all of the hype that surrounds the checklist, from all of the promotion that is done for the checklist as this kind of tool that is vital to improving surgical outcomes, to get a sense of how it actually worked in practice. And here's the results that come from the 101 facilities that were analyzed. And as you can see, it's across the board. So some of them, the outcomes have actually improved, and this is operative mortality. In some of them, they have significantly reduced, and some of them, and a large number of them in the middle, there's actually no difference at all. And so basically, what the result that came out of this study was that the use of the surgical safety checklist at scale across the entire province of Ontario resulted in no, on an aggregate, resulted in no benefits in terms of outcomes. So of course, this created a lot of attention because in many of these hospitals, these had been mandated as something that needed to be used. And so there was some follow-up analysis that was done in this paper. And as you can see, the questions that was raised as a result, as people were looking at these results more closely, was that the idea was that, yes, just the use of the checklist while everybody was using the checklist, not everyone was using the checklist in the same way, and not everyone was using the checklist in the way that it was intended to be used, so with fidelity. And so a lot of the kind of follow-up associated with the checklist was about, we hope that these findings from Ontario will lead to greater attention, not just to the intervention, but also to the implementation process. The idea is the implementation process is important. The last quote, the diligence with which the checklist is developed and applied is critical to its effectiveness. So it's not simply something that says, okay, I have this as a tool, it's a magic tool. If I use it, I'm going to get the outcomes. The question is, how do I actually implement it within my organization? And 10 years later, in 2019, there was a global study done about the WHO Safe Surgery Checklist, and the title of the paper is Barriers to Universal Acceptance. And the authors, their final conclusion was, despite substantial evidence advocating the need for the WHO checklist, the hesitancy among many healthcare providers to implement is a matter of concern. And so here is where this is a classic example of the no-do gap. And later on in the talk, I'll talk about the large amount of implementation research that has gone into the adoption and the implementation of the checklist. And so the Amazon blurb that says this is a simple tool to solve complex problems is clearly demonstrated to be imprecise, demonstrated to be inaccurate, because that needs to be a whole lot of implementation work that needs to happen in order for something that is as simple as a checklist to be utilized in a way that actually results in its outcomes. And so that gets us to the field of implementation science. It is a systematic study of methods and strategies that facilitate the uptake of evidence-based interventions in regular use. The field began in a lot where the field began was in behavioral sciences, with the observation that a lot of clinical practitioners who were therapists or psychologists were not, especially because there's a lot of possibility of interpretation of the evidence-based interventions for therapy. These therapeutic interventions were not utilized in the way that they should be utilized, or a lot of the therapists were using kind of techniques and methods that were old and outdated and were not kind of shifting to modern evidence. Since then, the field has evolved into a variety of different areas where implementation is important. There's no area where implementation is not important. And so the educational field has taken it on in terms of thinking about evidence-based use of interventions for school teaching. There's a lot of work that is done in clinical settings, in medical settings, and in public health settings, where we're beginning to, especially as in global health, a lot of the implementation research, implementation science interest is around implementing public health programs in communities at scale. And so the goal of implementation science as a field is to build, ultimately the objective, as I said earlier, is not simply to think about implementation on a case-by-case basis, but it is to develop a evidence-based about what works and what works in what settings. So the goal is to develop, test, and refine theories, frameworks, and measures to understand the process of implementation. So what is generalizable about implementation and what is not? What is context appropriate and what is not? And so overall, the third bullet, which is developing effective strategies for implementing evidence-based practices, that is the goal of the field. And as I said, as an emerging field, we are not quite there yet. As you will see as I go through this presentation, there's a lot of research that still needs to be done, especially because the field is so context dependent. Being able to think about what works across all settings, what works in some settings, how do we know what works in which settings, these are some of the kinds of questions that the implementation scientists are still grappling with. But ultimately, the goal of those who are like me, who think of themselves implementation scientists, is to think more generalized a bit across health conditions, across contexts. What are some of the kinds of things that we can say, if you do these kinds of things, you're going to result in better and more successful implementation and better and more successful outcomes? So where does implementation research fit within the overall translational continuum? As we think about the kind of developing evidence for programs, so a lot of the efficacy studies, the work that we do through our RCTs, the work that we do through our carefully controlled lab designs, is to think about, could a program work? What is the evidence? How do we know that something is going to be effective at achieving outcomes? Then the question becomes, does a program work? So the effectiveness studies, where we're beginning to do perhaps pragmatic trials, we're taking something out into the field, we're taking something out in the clinical settings, and we're trying to say, okay, so the fact that I know that this evidence works in lab settings, does it actually work in physical settings? But even then, when I think about effectiveness studies, I am doing this in fairly controlled settings. I have a research team that's collecting the data. I have perhaps experts who are providing the technical support that is needed. And so even though I'm testing through effectiveness studies whether this is working in real life situations, I am still doing it in a somewhat controlled, somewhat in a research environment. But then ultimately, the true test of all of this is does anybody, any clinician, any service provider, any teacher who is implementing it in their particular settings, can they make it work? And so what do we need to do to take it from these kind of relatively controlled research environments to the real world? And how do we actually make it work at scale in the real world? And what are the kinds of things, the supports and the scaffolding that is needed to be in place in order to actually intentionally have strategies to make the program work? And that's what the field of implementation science is about. And as you can see in the yellow box, just making a program work is not kind of, again, a simple formula. It's not something where I can just turn on a switch and say, if I do this, the program will work. There has to be a sequential process of thinking about, how do I actually go from knowing that the program works in a real life setting to actually making it work. And there are multiple stages associated with that. And so a lot of the frameworks that we talk about in implementation science have to do with, what are these different frameworks and what are these different stages and what needs to happen in each of these stages? And how do I make sure that I'm actually kind of supporting implementation through each of these different stages? And so when we think about doing an implementation research study, and I'll come back at the end to talk about these hybrid designs that have both kind of clinical that integrate clinical research and implementation research. But basically, when I'm doing clinical research, I am looking at the aim is to evaluate a clinical intervention or a policy or a health promotion intervention using a drug or a therapy or a procedure or a policy. And I'm beginning to look at, so what is the change in patient outcomes? And my unit of analysis is a patient or a community. In implementation research, the intervention is what I call an implementation strategy. And I want to be, this is something that we will talk about in a little bit more detail in a while, because this is where there is where a lot of the confusion in people who are new to implementation research is this difference in what is my intervention? What is it that I am actually testing? And what is it that I'm implementing? And so the implementation strategy is the intervention that you put in place in order to make my intervention work. And obviously, this needs to happen in the way that we do this is by providing implementation support. And so this could be changing organization culture. This could be providing incentives. This could be providing training. So these are the kinds of interventions that we look at. And later on, I'll talk about the taxonomy of implementation strategies, the kinds of things that people have discovered work in various settings. And so what I want to be looking at is, it's not just so much whether patient outcomes change, but what is more proximal to the patient outcomes? What needs to happen for my patient outcomes to change? In order for my patient outcomes to change, the evidence-based intervention has to be adopted, adhered to, has to be implemented with fidelity, like we saw in the surgical safety checklist, where implementation didn't necessarily mean that it was implemented the way it should be implemented. Is it implemented with the appropriate dose? And so those are the kinds of things that I'm looking at. And so I'll talk about this slide and then I will stop to see if there are any questions before I move on. And so this is over the years, as there was a lot of confusion between the kind of the idea of the intervention, the evidence-based intervention, and the implementation strategy. The implementation scientists have been trying to make the language as simple as possible, try to make the language jargon-free, and perhaps one can argue that this is really, really simple, but a lot of people find this quite useful. So we think about the intervention and the practice innovation as a thing. And the effectiveness research, as I said earlier, looks at whether the thing works in practice-based settings. But just because it works in practice-based settings doesn't necessarily mean that kind of everybody is going to know how to do it. And so implementation research looks at how best to help people do the thing. Implementation outcomes, which is not what I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it today, but it's an important aspect of thinking about what is it that we want from the implementation process. These are look at how well people do the thing. How do we know that implementation has been successful? And finally, implementation strategies are the kinds of things that we need to do to help people and organizations do the thing. So I have this slide is I have it in kind of various forms in my office, because usually when people come in and say, okay, what is implementation science? I hand this out. It's a kind of a good way of thinking about it, because being able to distinguish between the innovation and the implementation strategy is really important for those who want to do this kind of work. So let me stop here and ask if there are any questions before I move forward.
I have a quick question here. This is Michelle, the person who's driving.
Yeah.
I'm not driving anymore, no worries. I wanted, so I'm very embedded in design. I've been working in design thinking and the learning healthcare systems.
Yeah.
And so these are all models, and it would be really helpful for me if I could understand how those interface with implementation science.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. And that I will send you later on a paper that we have written that integrates design and implementation and improvement and evaluation. But in a nutshell, the idea is that to be able to think about implementation strategies, you can't think about implementation strategies without involving those who actually are working in the settings in which the implementation takes place. And so design thinking and co-design and co-production and the kinds of things that are parts of learning health systems are critically important, because they allow us to be able to say, what kind of implementation strategy is appropriate for this particular context. So you have to be able to design your strategy, just like you have to be able to design your intervention. And then you have to actually think about then you do the implementation research around, is it working or not in my particular context? And then coming back, thinking about from a learning perspective, and I'll talk a little bit about learning evaluations later as well, because that's a key component of implementation science, is being able to test it using PDSA methods, using improvement methods to make sure that we're adapting and changing and refining and optimizing for the particular context. So all of these fields are fit together. And thank you for raising this question, because part of where a lot of my focus has been is thinking about how do these fields integrate, because all of them do, but because they've grown up kind of in different from different backgrounds, because the researchers who have engaged in each of these come with different training, they have essentially been treated as silos, but actually they do need to be integrated. Okay, so this is just reinforcing what I said earlier. When we think about an implementation pipeline, we talk about efficacy and effectiveness, and then we need to be thinking about implementation in the middle in order for us to improve outcomes. And again, implementation doesn't happen it's not one-step process, but there has to be a sequence of activities that need to happen in order for implementation, in order for us to be able to study how implementation works, and to be able to make sure that we are putting all of the things in place for implementation to happen successfully. And so to guide us in this process, the field of implementation scientists decided that they need to create models, theories, and frameworks that would help implementers and implementation researchers. And so what started out as a good idea very quickly went out of control, because everybody wanted to have their own model, theory, or framework rather than using somebody else's. And so what began as I need to think about having some systematic way of managing my implementation process became this kind of jungle where there are 100 conceptual frameworks for implementation science. And anybody who's entering this field, the first question that they ask is how not to be overwhelmed by this process, and how do I begin to select something that is useful. And so while theories, models, and frameworks are useful, being able to think about which one to use, which one is most important for me, which is valid in my setting, becomes an important question. And different framework and different theories, models, and frameworks do different things. So there was an article of 5 or 6 years ago, which is a seminal article in the field that talks about what do I use all of these different models, theories, and frameworks for. And there are 3 different uses of models, theories, and frameworks in implementation science. That is what we call process models. And process models is like a roadmap. So if I want to implement something, and it gives me a step-by-step way of thinking about how do I actually take an evidence-based intervention and put it into practice. So it is a roadmap and a guide for implementation. Then there are a whole variety of frameworks called determinant frameworks or implementation theories that help me understand the barriers and facilitators for implementation. What is it that affects implementation outcomes? What gets in the way of successful implementation? And then there is a set of framework called evaluation frameworks, obviously, that looks at my implementation process and allows me to evaluate whether I have implemented successfully or not. And obviously, there's a little bit of overlap between the determinant frameworks and the evaluation frameworks, because I could use a determinant framework for evaluation as well. So again, these differentiations are not absolute. They're just kind of different ways of looking at making sense of the large number of frameworks that exist. I am not going to spend a whole lot of time kind of taking you through these frameworks because I wanted to put them in here. So those of you who are looking at the slide deck later, have them as a reference. But these are some common. So when people ask, well, what frameworks do I use? The advice that I give them is, well, you need to think about what particular problem you're trying to solve, and then go back through the frameworks and think about what the appropriate frameworks are. Unfortunately, often because it is overwhelming and people don't, the amount of time that is taken to really think through which framework is appropriate for me is something that people find difficult to do. They reach for the first framework that is available. And so as a result, some of these frameworks have become more popular than others. To be fair, they are more popular than others because they are more general purpose frameworks. And so they fit a larger number of problems better. However, having said that, what it does is that also it results in a kind of a somewhat formulaic application of these frameworks, but they're really thinking about which of these frameworks are useful and why do they work. And so while I'm presenting them therefore here as a way of saying that if you really want to start with a framework, rather than if you're going to feel overwhelmed and looking at the 100 frameworks that exist, these might be ones to start with. The general advice is still do your due diligence. Think a little bit more carefully about what your implementation theory is. Think a little bit more carefully about what your research problem is, and use that as a way of selecting the framework. So in the REAIM framework, I'm just going to go very quickly through this framework. I'm not going to have a whole lot of time to do justice to them here. There's a whole, when I teach this class, I spend several hours just talking about frameworks. So in the few minutes that I have, the REAIM framework is a common evaluation framework. It has now been integrated into the implementation science pantheon, but it's not. It came from a public health, from the field of public health, earlier, even before the field of implementation science actually existed, and is a way of evaluating both the effectiveness of an intervention and the implementation process. So as you can see, the kinds of things that I look at in the REAIM evaluation is, did I reach those who needed the intervention? How effective was my intervention? Was it adopted by the people who needed to adopt it? How well was it implemented? And then is it sustained over time? So it is a good multi-purpose framework for evaluation that has been used in a variety of different settings. The other common framework is called the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research. Many of you might have heard it referred to as CFIR, which is how implementation scientists refer to it. CFIR is a general purpose determinant framework, which means that it allows for an understanding of the barriers and facilitators for implementation. This is the graphic around the CFIR framework. What it talks about is that, going from the left to the right, if I start with an intervention, in order for me to be able to move from an unadapted intervention, which might be the result of a clinical trial that says this is a piece of evidence that needs to be implemented because it is promising in terms of outcomes. But in order for me to actually make it work, I have to be in the right-hand side of this figure, which is where I am adapting it for my particular setting. And so the graphic shows the path that I need to take to go from my left, my unadapted intervention, to my adapted intervention, and the kinds of things that get in the way of my doing that successfully. So I might have individuals involved in implementing my intervention, might have, for a variety of reasons, might not find it acceptable, might not find it appropriate, might find it too difficult, might find it infeasible. So I have to be thinking about the individuals who are delivering the intervention. I need to think about the organization within which the intervention is located. And so I could have an organization culture, for example, that doesn't support innovation. So that might be a barrier to implementation. I might have a complicated implementation process. The implementation of my intervention might require significant amounts of training, might require significant amount of equipment, might require multiple steps that people are not willing to do. So the implementation process in and of itself might be complicated, or there might be political constraints, there might be policy constraints, there might be constraints that come from outside my institution, which is the outer setting. And so what what CFIR does is it provides this kind of laundry list of the different kinds of things that can affect the implementation process. And therefore it is, as I said, therefore it is very effective because it can be used for a wide variety of different implementation problems. But that also means that it gets misused a lot because there are more specialty frameworks that might be better used for certain implementation issues that don't actually get used. Another popular framework is the EPIS framework, which stands for Exploration, Preparation, Implementation, and Sustainment. And the EPIS framework is kind of adds an additional degree of nuance to the CFIR framework. So it has, if you see in the middle of this framework, it has all of the kinds of things that we talked about with CFIR. So it has the innovation-specific factors, it has the inner context, it has the outer context, it has kinds of things that affect the quality of implementation, but it also frames it within these 4 stages: exploration, preparation, implementation, and sustainment, which is kind of a sequential way of approaching the implementation process. And so EPIS adds on kind of a layer of that not everything happens simultaneously, that needs to be, there's a temporal sequence in implementation, and different factors might be affecting the implementation process at different stages of my implementation. And so I need to be paying attention not just to these factors that affect implementation, but I need to be paying attention to when in the implementation process they occur as well. So it adds an additional degree of nuance to thinking about factors, the barriers and facilitators of implementation. And finally, the last framework that I'm going to talk about, and I'll stop again for some questions, is this whole suite of frameworks that have been developed by the National Implementation Research Network that is based out of UNC Chapel Hill, that talks about the different considerations that are needed in order for me to implement well. So it's not just a one piece of implementation. In order for me to be able to implement appropriately, I need my usable interventions. This is the evidence base. I need to have something that actually works. But in addition, I need to have people who do the implementation. It has to be done in a way that where the right implementation process is done at the right time. So I need to think about what the stages are. I need to be able to continue to test and refine my implementation using PDSA and other improvement cycles. And then I need to understand the barriers and facilitators to implementation, which are the implementation drivers. So this provides kind of a cohesive, holistic view of the different things that need to happen to support the implementation process. And for each of these frameworks, if you go to the website, there's a large amount of resources that exist that tell you how to use them. There are toolkits that can be used. And so the reason I presented these 4 was not only because they are the most popular, but because there's a whole lot of kind of resources that support them as well. And so let me kind of finish up this part of my presentation. So just in terms of wading through the jungle, a large number of implementation frameworks exist. Many of them are based on kind of just they're a jumble of multiple theories. And so, all frameworks are incomplete, but some of them are useful. They help to structure thinking both for practitioners and researchers about the implementation process. And so, those of you who are interested in this field, and those of you who are interested in thinking about a better and more careful use of implementation frameworks, being able to think a little bit through what is the right framework for my problem is a better approach than just saying, well, I'm going to reach out and use CFIR because everybody uses that. Okay, let me stop here. And I see that the number of the number of chats is increasing. So I'm imagining that there are people who are posting comments or questions. So let me stop here and see if there's anything that I can answer right now.
Actually, it was just comments about that similar questions to Michelle's. So let's open it up. Raise your hand, type it, unmute yourself.
And I'm sorry, I recognize I'm running through this at 100 miles an hour, but that's kind of because I have a lot of content to cover in a short time, but I'm happy to take questions.
I have a question, Rohit, and maybe I'm getting ahead of the talk, but first of all, this has been a fantastic introduction so far. I've learned a lot. I was wondering if people are interested in getting more training on implementation science, what you'd recommend. I know you're planning to do additional training sessions and deliver those in the coming year. But then if people are interested in more formal training in implementation science, where might they, what were the best programs for that?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking that. I was wondering whether I should put a couple of slides with resources here at the end of this presentation, and I actually chose not to because I thought it would just be kind of a slide that flashed in front of people's eyes. So as we're beginning to, I'm working with Emma to put we're creating a website that will be hosted through the CCTSD website, where we are actually going to put, we're going to point people through both the resources in terms of there are some new books that have come out in this field, some of the other CTSAs like the CCTSD that have kind of implementation cores where resources are available, and what the most common training programs are both for researchers and practitioners. So if people are interested, what I can do also is I can extract those slides that I have in other presentations, and I can also make those available, but they will be on the website relatively soon. Okay, so let me move on to kind of the next piece, which is, okay, so now I've used these frameworks, I've identified what my barriers and facilitators are for the implementation process. What do I do next? And then, so as I said earlier, now I need to be thinking about interventions, and in implementation science language, these are called implementation strategies. These are methods or techniques to enhance the adoption, implementation, and sustainability of an intervention. And as you can see, there's been a lot of work on implementation strategies, but a lot of this work has really been because implementation always, before people began to think in a systematic way about implementation science, implementation was done kind of in an ad hoc way. A lot of the effort was focused on the evidence generation piece, and then implementation was a little bit of hand waving. Well, maybe a little training here, maybe a little support here, maybe a little coaching here, maybe a little feedback here. And so what people have done over the last few years is taken the time to look at what have researchers in various settings done to improve the implementation process, and can we begin to create a taxonomy of implementation strategies so that at least we know, if we want to think about what are the kinds of things that people can do to support implementation, at least there is some sense of the kinds of approaches that we can potentially use. And so this project that was a 5-year effort has led to a taxonomy. There is a separate taxonomy of behavior change strategies that I'm not covering today, but this is kind of the standard taxonomy of strategies. So there are 63 strategies that have been identified across these different buckets that are a good starting point for people who want to think about how do I go about looking at how to support implementation. And as you can see, a lot of these are not necessarily for those of us who've been doing implementation. These are not things that we don't know, but it just kind of brings all of these things together in a single place. So the kinds of things I might do is I might provide interactive assistance, I might facilitate, I might provide TA, I might provide supervision, adaptation. I might be looking at kind of what are the contextual factors that affect my ability to implement. I might do some adaptation. Obviously, building good stakeholder relationships, training and education, we're providing incentives, changing infrastructure. So if I have to come back, this is where there's the intersection between quality improvement and implementation science come in. If I have to kind of come back and use lean methods, for example, to streamline processes so that implementation is easier. So this is a whole set of activities. And again, there is a website that allows people to go in and explore some of these strategies in more detail, including having some idea around where they have been used and where they've been effective. But a lot of the research around implementation science is in this kind of better understanding of strategies, better understanding of where they work and how they work and how to make them work. And so when we think about strategies, there are two types of strategies. The discrete strategies, which is just a single thing that I can do. So I'm going to provide WhatsApp reminders, for example, the work that we do in Ghana, as we are working with the teams that are supporting implementation of, we have a neonatal multi-component neonatal mortality reduction program there. The coaches who are providing the support for implementation get reminders once a week. So that might be a single discrete strategy. But more often than not, a single strategy in and of itself has been shown to not to work very well. And so more and more the strategies that we're thinking about are what we call multifaceted strategies. So we take discrete strategies, so it's maybe training and reminders and coaching and consultation and financial incentives, and we put them together. And over time, some of these multifaceted strategies have been protocolized. So there are kind of standard chunks of groups of strategies that have been shown to be effective and are available for those of you who are doing implementation research. If you want to think about, we want to test the application of a particular brand of strategy, these kinds of strategies are available for testing as well. So what do we know about strategies? We know that several strategies have been found to be effective under some, but not all circumstances. Again, context matters a lot in the identification of implementation strategies. And so, individually, these strategies might work, but overall groups of strategies work better. Most strategies result in modest improvements. There's no single one-size-fits-all kind of magic wand that we can wave and improve implementation. There is a multifaceted strategies seem to work better than individual strategies, and multi-level strategies. So strategies that target both individuals, organizations, policy together seem to work better than strategies that focus on a particular aspect. So for example, just improving organizational readiness. So all of this kind of points to the fact that nothing is simple about implementation. And so the idea is that as we begin to think about, so coming to the question therefore becomes, how do we actually select what is the right strategy? How do we go about strategy selection? And this is where a lot of current implementation research is focused, is on thinking about good packaging, good tailoring, good adaptation, and testing of these multifaceted and multi-level strategies. Because the common approaches in the past, as I've said, has been basically train and pray, right? So let's do some training, let's hope for the best. ISLA-GS stands for, it seemed like a good idea at the time. So I am just doing something and I'm hoping for the best. And the kitchen sink approach is, let me do a little bit of this, let me do a little bit of that, but let me not kind of think about how these things get packaged in some systematic way that allows me to be able to say, okay, what is my theory? What is the reason for bringing a particular strategy together? How do I know how to mix these strategies and how do I test them? Do some independent testing first? Maybe I have a factorial design where I'm testing different levels of different strategies and looking at what the interaction effects are. This kind of general systematic approach using research methods that we know to testing the strategy has not been done a whole lot until relatively recently. And this is where a lot of this field is focused right now. And so a better approach to selecting strategies is to identify the determinants first. So use a good framework to identify what my factors are and what my most important factors are. You use data so that I can also measure the extent to which these different determinants are affecting my outcomes. Link my strategies to identify determinants, and then using my theory, understanding my local context to narrow the list of strategies. And then this is what the question Michelle asked earlier, where did design come in? Beginning to engage my stakeholders, using a co-design process for people who actually have lived experience, people who understand the context better, and using that as a way to select and operationalize strategies. And so there have been so methods have been developed for being able to use this approach in a systematic way. There's a method called intervention mapping or implementation mapping that I am not covering today, that allows for a step-by-step approach that allows us to be able to start with determinants, use the underlying theory, engage stakeholders, and come up with a package of carefully thought out strategies that I might test in a research design. So what does it mean from implications of strategy selection? It's not enough just to ask whether a strategy works. We need to know the context. We need to know where, when, and for whom it works. We need to know how to combine and tailor strategies for different situations and context. And therefore, part of that is to understand mechanisms through which the strategies produce results. And all of these are open research questions right now. And this is where a lot of the researchers in implementation science are focusing on. And so I come back to the surgical safety checklist. So we started off saying this is a fairly simple intervention. And of course, as you have seen, what this shows is this is the taxonomy of strategies that I shared with you earlier. So if you look at these colors are the different domains of strategies. What you have on the vertical axis here is all the way from 2009 to 2019. Studies that have done the implementation research studies associated with the implementation surgical safety checklist. And as you can see here, this is like what you're seeing is like a rainbow. Over the last 10 years, a lot of researchers have studied a lot of different strategies just to implement the surgical safety checklist alone. So this idea that somehow kind of magically I have this intervention that is going to work without doing a large amount of research, a large amount of kind of study about implementation, that I'm going to be able to make it work at scale is a fallacy. And so as you're seeing here, implementation in and of itself is a complex problem. And therefore, there's a lot of research that needs to be done in order to get it right. And so how do we do that? The types of research designs that include implementation within a larger clinical trials are now called hybrid designs. And so a lot of implementation researchers use hybrid designs because they recognize that often it's not enough, because in terms of how funding agencies work, but also in terms of the fact that we're not just doing implementation for the sake of doing implementation. We're doing implementation to achieve benefits for our patients, to achieve benefits for our communities and our populations. And so we can't disentangle implementation research from effectiveness research. And so what these hybrid trials do is therefore they're joint research designs that look at both the implementation process and the effectiveness of the intervention itself. And again, I would not get too hung up about these hybrid type of designs. We had a conversation yesterday with a kind of group of NIH researchers around the fact that somehow what has happened is because we've got these three types, people are spending a lot more time thinking about which type their research design is than really worrying about what their research problem is. But in general, as we go from hybrid type 1 to hybrid type 3, these hybrid trials have placed greater emphasis on the effectiveness side or greater emphasis on the implementation side. So as you can see in this diagram, a hybrid type 1 is basically a clinical effectiveness research trial with an implementation focus. So I might do some qualitative work that looks at what my barriers of facilitators to implementation might be. A hybrid type 2 design might have two equal aims, that both focusing on implementation and on effectiveness, and I might have two trials, one trial that is an effectiveness trial and one trial that's an implementation trial. And a hybrid type 3 design is one which really has a kind of an emphasis on the implementation itself. So my particular focus might be a situation where I really have an intervention that I know works well. It has been tested in a wide variety of settings. What I really am looking for is an implementation strategy, or I'm testing or comparing multiple implementation strategies to try and figure out what is the appropriate implementation approach to make this particular intervention work at scale. Okay, so this is a good time, I think, to let me talk about guiding principles for implementation research. And I will stop here. I have a couple of other slides that are related to other types of evaluation, but I think that they just reinforce what I have already said here. So let me stop. Let me talk a little bit about guiding principles. about implementation research. So implementation research may need several phases, though they may not follow a linear sequence. So this comes back to the question of learning and how implementation research fits well within kind of the learning health systems framework, where I am, because it is so context dependent, I don't have a single, I don't have knowledge up front about what works in my context. So I might need to do some experimentation. And based on experimentation, I might need to use that data that I get from experiments to learn a little bit more and do the next level of research. Experimental designs are obviously preferred to observational designs. This is not just true for implementation research. This is true for all research. But in implementation science, these might not always be practical. So I might have to, so being able to think about how do I build an observational component into my design, because I might not be able to manipulate my environment, because I might not be able to have an appropriate comparison group, I might not be able to have a control group. So thinking about how do I come up with these kind of complex designs that are where these might not be the kind of the gold standard designs, but are good fit to my context, is something that I need to be paying attention to. Understanding processes is important. So being able to build a process evaluation component into my research design, and then thinking about mixed methods designs. But not only am I thinking about the outcomes themselves, but being able to document the intervention, document the implementation strategy, so that I can understand not just whether my study has good internal validity, but what kind of external validity it has and what might be barriers to external validity is really important. And so let me finish with where those of you who are interested in this field, and those of you who are interested in kind of where some critical research areas are. These are some opportunities areas for the future. So, continued notion of adaptation. How do I adapt to context? And how do I understand context? How do I measure context? Sustainability, of course, is sustainability, scale up. These are issues that are kind of that have been important for a long time, and thinking about how do I implement in a way that is not just when the funding vanishes, whether the implementation is no longer sustainable. What are the factors that make a program sustainable? Is an area of research. De-implementation. This is relatively new. The idea that it's not just enough to be able to think about how to implement new procedures and processes. If there are people who are doing things that are old or doing things that don't work, then how do we actually get this as much as an intentional process to get people to de-implement as it is to implement? As we're getting involved in data science and complexity, how do we begin to use big data? How do we begin to think about new designs? And then ultimately, equity has become very important in this field. And how do we begin to think about what is the right kind of implementation ethics, and who should be involved in implementation? How do we involve stakeholders? How do we involve people in lived experience? How do we begin to think about not just reach, but reach in an equitable way? These are some of the kind of ongoing challenges that we're facing in this field. So let me stop with kind of a phrase that I always use at the end of all of my implementation science presentations. When it comes to implementation, what is worth doing is worth doing well. And so there's a lot of work in front of us to think about how do we take what we know and how do we put it into action. As Jessica said, this has been really kind of a 100-foot, 100 miles an hour overview to the field. I will be doing more of an in-depth, I'm doing a one-day course on implementation science in October, and that will be kind of advertised through the CCTSD. We are putting together this website that will also provide you with more resources. And so we're continuing. This is one step of our kind of longer process in being able to build implementation science D&I capacity more broadly across our institutions. So thank you for listening to me. Let me stop here. And I know that we only have 5 minutes, but I'm happy to take questions in that time.
There is a question from Carrie, and it's a great one. So I'd rather have Carrie ask it. Carrie, would you mind?
Well, sure. I'll just read my question. It just says, thanks for the structure and all the steps and sequence of this type of work. What do you see as either the minimum publishable unit from these steps or related research questions, or what do you see as the important dissemination and publication landmarks within the framework that you've presented?
Okay, that's the minimum. So let me say what the question is whether when you ask minimum publishable, I'm going to talk about what actually can get published, and let me talk about what should what should get published. You can get hundreds of papers on barriers and facilitators to implementation published. All I need to do is I need to use CFIR. I need to look at my particular setting. I need to do a bunch of qualitative interviews. I need to kind of put it in within an implementation science framework, and I need to send it off to a journal. Implementation science as a journal will not publish it anymore, but there are hundreds of journals that will publish it. I don't think it advances the field in any way at all, because we all know ultimately I can tell you what barriers to implementation are without ever having to use CFIR, without having to kind of look at a paper. But that's the minimum standard. Where I really think the place where people can do a real service to the field is by thinking, is what I talked about earlier, is really kind of thinking about a systematic way of looking at how do I come up with implementation strategies. Not just to think about, okay, we do training and we do coaching, but to be able to use some of the theory-based approaches to develop a theory for implementation, to come up with strategies that are hypotheses that are based on that theory, and to come up with a good research design to test it. And therefore, to be able to come to say, at the end of that study, to say, these are things we have discovered that seem to have universal applicability. These are the things that we've discovered that seem to have specific applicability. These are the kinds of things we don't know about. The more people spend time in doing that kind of work and that kind of publication, the more I think it'll advance the field, and the more I think it'll be of utility to others. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you very much.
Okay, any other questions?